Professor Vivek Reddy, who came to St. Louis from New York City. That's quite a sacrifice. Anyway, Vivek received his MD from University of Michigan, and then went to continue his education residency at Yale, and from there to fellowship in our neighboring city, Chicago, I think, right?
Yeah.
Chicago, and then on, and then in Boston, Mass General. And after that, I don't know where it went. Now he's in New York City and at Mount Sinai. And Vivek is really very well known in being an experimentalist as far as clinical care is concerned, by really trying to adapt to the clinic and trying to evaluate new and emerging technologies and new approaches to therapy. And that's what I asked him to talk about today. So thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Jerome. And thanks for the invitation. It's a very interesting day. It's really, I learned a lot, and I hope that this lecture you find useful. It's a very clinical lecture, and there are a lot of slides in this lecture. So I apologize if some I'm going to go through very, very quickly, and others I'll dwell on a little bit more. But I will be talking about both atrial fibrillation and ventricular arrhythmias if I have any time left. Lots of disclosure.
Completely my fault.
That's okay. I'm going to be talking about, almost everything I'm going to be talking about after the first couple of slides are going to be unapproved devices. Let me start off a little bit conceptually, and a lot of this all of you know already, but I think it's worth talking about. When we think about atrial fibrillation, at least from a therapeutic perspective, and specifically from a catheter ablation perspective, we try to separate into either paroxysmal or non-paroxysmal. In paroxysmal atrial fibrillation, the physiology that is operative in the majority of patients, though not all, is a focal trigger leading to fibrillary conduction. And specifically, the triggers tend to be within the pulmonary veins. So the procedure that we perform, conceptually, this is not rocket science, right? We take a catheter, we ablate around the pulmonary veins so as to create a ring of scar tissue so that these impulses can't travel to the atrium proper and cause atrial fibrillation. Now again, conceptually, it's not rocket science, but technically it's difficult. And if you look at, and I should also point out, if you look at the actual success, these are two of the major clinical trials. This is using radiofrequency ablation, this is cryoablation. And if you look at ablation versus drugs, ablation works much better than drugs. And this is no surprise. We knew this from many single-center studies before the multi-center studies, and there's really no controversy here. But at the same time, you see our success rate is not that great, and this is only at 1 year. If you follow these patients out further, we have diminishing success. Now, the question is why? And there's really two major mechanisms of failure. The first is the problem of reversible electrical isolation. What I mean by that is when we're ablating, as we make each lesion, we cause an area of necrosis in the surrounding area of reversible injury, either whether it's tissue edema or hemorrhage or whatever. And the problem with that is once this abates, even though the veins are isolated at the end of the procedure, you can have resumption of conduction through any gaps in ablation lines to resumption of fibrillation. Now the question is, how often does this happen? The answer is too often. The real answer is we don't know exactly. There are very few studies that have looked at this. But there is one study which still has not been published as far as I know, called the GAP-AF trial, which is a very complicated trial. It's multi-center in Germany. But I just want to go through one part of it, which is they took patients with paroxysmal atrial fibrillation, isolated the pulmonary veins, proved that there was isolation at the end of the procedure, brought all the patients back at 3 months. So this is not a symptom-driven second procedure, but a protocol-driven second procedure. And they asked the question, are the veins still isolated? And if you ask the question, what % of the veins had any amount of PV reconnection at 3 months, the answer was 70%. So that means even though all the veins were isolated, time equals, whatever, 1 hour after the procedure, only 30% of those patients had all veins isolated in a durable fashion. So this is a big problem. But now one point is, should one despair? Well, again, I point you to what the alternative is, which is drugs. So on the one hand, we're much better than the alternative. On the other hand, we want to be better than we are. And I'm not going to go through all these. There's lots of methodological changes that we've all instituted in our own practices as we've learned about the problems of durable isolation. And
So Vivek, I have a question from you,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
it's okay.
From those that you said 70% reconnected, but did they also have atrial fibrillation?
The answer is no. So one of the very interesting questions is why is there a discordance between reconnection and this? Now there are a couple of possibilities. One possibility is we didn't look long enough. So if you wait long enough, remember many of these patients have recurrence. If you follow not just 1 year, but 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. Number two, we may not have looked hard enough. So, it's one thing if you do an EKG every time the patient comes to the clinic. It's another thing if you have an implantable monitor. The third thing is, and I believe that there is something to this, there probably are effects beyond PV isolation. Whether it's affecting autonomic influences by affecting the ganglia or nervous inputs into the veins or something else. There probably is something else. But I do believe that this is one of the primary reasons why if you follow the patients out long enough, the majority of them recur if the veins are not isolated. Again, there's a number of methodological changes, including force sensing catheters and other things that we'll talk about in a minute. And we looked very carefully after very carefully doing the ablation, spending a lot of time. We looked at our patients who came back for a redo procedure after a first ever procedure, and what we saw was the majority of the veins had remained isolated. So we are getting better at this. But it also means that when you look at studies like this, and you'll see there's no reference in this, because it doesn't even matter. When you have a very high rate of PV isolation, when you look at studies that compare, for example, PV isolation plus CAFE, PV, and CAFE, it's hard to do much with this from a mechanistic perspective because we don't know what PVI means. PVI means that ablations were placed around the veins. Some of the veins are isolated and some are not. So that's just, when you're looking at literature, it's very difficult to interpret from a mechanistic perspective. Now, I said there were two mechanisms of recurrence. The second mechanism is the problem of non-pulmonary vein triggers, because you can have a trigger here or in the right atrium. And so we looked at our own data, and our data suggests, and we did this very carefully, I won't go through the methodology, but we said a non-PV trigger is in those situations where we see a non-PV trigger, meaning you give medication and you see an area firing, or the patient comes back with clinical recurrence and you check and the veins are all isolated, so by definition it has to be a non-PV trigger. So it's a very strict definition of non-PV trigger. And even then, we had 23% of the patients have non-PV triggers. So this is a very important problem. Clinically, we don't talk much about this, mainly because it's a pain in the butt to deal with. But this is one of the biggest problems. And an area, by the way, that I think ECGI mapping could be very, very interesting and useful. Okay. So we're trying to improve our rate of durable isolation, and this is the technology part of the talk. I'm just going to go through this very quickly. We now have balloon ablation catheters. There's the cryoballoon catheter, which you push up against the vein and freeze. There's also the visually guided laser, which just got FDA approval, I think, earlier this week. So this is a catheter that has a camera at the back end, so you're looking inside of the balloon, and you manipulate a laser to make the lesion. So this is a time lapse. And what you're seeing here is the balloon is pushed up against the face of the vein. The white is the vein, the red is blood. And this is the laser being manipulated and the lesion being delivered. So what's nice about this is the first time we non-surgeons are able to actually see what's going on during our procedure. The advantage, of course, being that you could make each lesion contiguous with the previous lesion. Of course, we don't see tissue depth and other limitations, but it's one step closer to this. And we have a lot of preclinical data showing very nice lesions, and it's interesting if you look at cryo versus RF, the most recent publication, Fire and Ice, which was published. Basically, these are two trials that compared point-by-point radiofrequency ablation and cryoablation, and really they show no difference in success rates. And I think it's important because in people with paroxysmal AF, what these data suggest is that cryoballoon ablation, which is technically a lot easier, works as well as RF ablation. Similarly, we did a study, again, multi-center study in paroxysmal AF patients, comparing the laser balloon that I just showed you with RF. Again, very similar outcomes. So together, what these data told us is that balloon ablation, at least in these centers with these operators, gave us similar outcomes to point-by-point ablation, which is what we'd all been doing for a decade plus.
So, excuse me, in all your studies here, how are you defining the recurrence? Is this
So
somebody
recurrence
that
is,
actually comes back to the clinic and
yeah.
is complaining?
No, that would be a low bar. That's what we used to do. Now, these are FDA studies. So all of the patients have, they have monitors, of course. They have, 1 week or 2, I can't remember, 1 or 2 week monitors. And they have a monitor to take home and send a transmission once a week, plus with any symptoms. And any AFib, A-Flutter, AT episode that lasts greater than 30 seconds is defined as recurrent. Now, they don't have implantable monitors. It's possible, indeed likely, that some of them may have had some other, episodes. But at least anything symptomatic and anything that was that with reasonable monitoring was not seen. Now, how durable, by the way, are these balloon-based technologies? Just like with RF, it's technique dependent, but the data looks pretty good. These are 2 studies we did. You'll notice the very small number of patients, 19 with the cryo, 52 with laser, because these were all studies where we isolated the veins, brought the patients back at 3 months for a second look. These are complex studies. What we saw was in the laser, durable isolation was seen in 91% of the veins. That was with cryo. And with laser, durable isolation was seen in 86%. So basically around 90% of the veins are isolated, which is a lot better. But I just want to point out, even with 90% isolation on a per vein basis, we still have problems. What I'm showing you here, this is the probabilistic model. Just pay attention to the dotted line for a second. So on the x-axis is the probability, it shouldn't even be probability, it's the occurrence of chronic isolation on a per vein basis, okay? And on the y-axis is the probability that all the veins are isolated in a given patient. Because remember, a patient has more than one vein. We don't want to isolate just one vein. We want all the veins isolated in a given patient. So if we have 90% of the veins isolated on a per vein basis, that translates to a 65%. That means 65% of the patients will have all veins isolated statistically. So in order for us to really be in this area where we get 90 to 100% of the patients having no veins isolated, we basically have to have about 95% or higher of the veins isolated on a per vein basis. So this is it's a very high bar. Low bar? No, high bar. It's hard to do. So that last little bit is actually the hardest that we have to, the hardest that we have to achieve. So there are other advances in point ablation technology. You guys know about force sensing catheters. So now we have catheters where we can tell if we're touching tissue and how well we're touching tissue. There's no doubt these catheters have helped us in our understanding of how to manipulate. And there are clinical trials that we don't need to get into, but the point is when you have good contact, you have better success than when you don't have good contact. There's improvements in cooling of the tip during RF ablation. I don't want to spend time on that, but I do want to talk about this, because this, I think, is the next sort of evolution of radiofrequency ablation. Now, I have to explain this a little bit. When we started doing radiofrequency ablation, one of the problems was that as you ablate tissue and the tissue gets hot, char would form on the catheter. That would then embolize to the brain and cause a stroke. So the solution was to cool the tip. So there's saline that's pumped through the tip of the catheter that cools it. The problem, and it works well in terms of preventing stroke. The problem with that is that we don't know exactly how much energy to deliver into the tissue because we have no feedback from the tissue that we're actually heating the tissue. So the next generation of catheters, and this is one of them that I'm going to show you, called ACT, well, that's the name of the company. Actually, they have thermocouples on the surface of the catheter. So as you deliver energy to the tissue, you can see what's happening on the surface, which turns out to actually reflect quite well what's happening in the tissue. What this will do, why do we care? Well, this particular catheter is interesting because, as I showed you, it has these 3 thermocouples as well as thermocouples on the back end. It also has a split tip, so you can see very small electrograms. And the tip is, instead of made of platinum, it's mainly made of industrial grade diamond, which apparently diamond has extremely high thermodiffusivity, so the heat equilibrates very quickly. Why am I telling you all this? Well, what this ultimately ends up is a catheter where you deliver energy based on the tissue temperature, at least the surface temperature. So you end up delivering energy very efficiently into the tissue. So instead of making 30-second lesions, you can make 10-second lesions. And that doesn't sound like much, except when you realize you may be making 80 or 100 lesions, and suddenly that number adds up. So we're going to be able to cut our procedure time by at least a half, and probably even more, which is a really big deal from a clinical perspective. That's one company. I'm going to skip this. That's one company, but there are a number of different companies doing the same thing. Online visualization of lesion transmural, one of the big limitations we've always had is how do we know that we're making lesions? Because we can't actually see the lesions. In the past, people have tried to use ultrasound, and I think we basically decided it was interesting, but it doesn't work. It's too hard. Catheter tip microelectrodes, and I think that's something that will get us closer. There's also a company that's looking at optical coherence reflectometry, which is a very interesting approach, very high resolution, but it's limited to 2 millimeters depth. And then the last one I want to talk about is LuxCath, which is looking at NADH autofluorescence. So all of you know NADH, it's in cells, it's a coenzyme, and the point is that it can fluoresce. So if you excite right around 350, then it emits strongly about between 450 and 470. So they have a catheter which has a laser that's used to excite the tissue and a spectrometer to look at that excitation. So what you're looking at is, in here, this is one of the animals. This is the catheter not touching tissue, and pushing, touching and really pushing hard against the tissue. So when the catheter is not touching tissue, it's just sitting in blood, and there's no NADH in the blood to be able to visualize. As it touches tissue, you see this peak at 450, well, 460, whatever. How do you use that? Well, this is what happens during ablation. In addition to knowing you have contact, as you ablate, the NADH signature basically decreases. And here you're seeing this decrease, and here you're actually seeing a decrease in real time. This is over the course of 10, 15 seconds, whatever. So what we're normally used to looking at is a small drop in impedance, but instead we could see a large drop in fluorescence. And you can see the dynamic range here is much more useful potentially than looking at a small change in impedance.
How thick a tissue can you do that?
Great question. The real answer is I don't know. But we recently did an experiment where we took tissue, sort of bunched it up, put a catheter on one side, another catheter on the other side, delivered the excitation from this side and received from this side. And as we started ablating tissue, we could see it disappearing from this side. So, and that tissue was about 6 millimeters thick. So it has potential, but there are some potential limitations too. I don't know about how much light diffuses, and there's a number of questions. It's interesting. There's also regional ablation catheters. And I just put this in a category because instead of point ablation, we start off with these catheters that have multiple electrodes, and the problem with these was that char would form on them because they weren't irrigated. Now we have irrigated catheters, and these are in clinical trials here in the United States where you can take the catheter and basically push it up against tissue and ablate from all of these at the same time. And then more recently, this is another balloon catheter with multiple electrodes which can deliver energy. And there's also a camera on the back end, so you can actually look inside. So here, this catheter is pushed up against tissue. You can decide which electrode you want to ablate from. So the idea is to be able to move this around and ablate. And I think it's a very interesting catheter. We'll be doing cases in humans in the next couple of months, so we'll see how well it works. Finally, I want to talk about what I'll call global ablation systems, which are ablation catheter systems that ablate in a much more expansive way, and I'll show you what I mean. There's 3 of them. One is collimated ultrasound, the second is called the globe catheter, and the third is a very interesting, both a system and a concept, which is Back to the Future, looking at electroporation. The collimated ultrasound catheter is a catheter that is partly driven by the operator and partly robotically driven. It has electromagnetic sensors, so you know where the tip is, and you can see the kind of shapes that it can take. So the idea is, in addition to, as it's manipulated inside the chamber, it has 2 capabilities. One is the ability to visualize using M-mode echo to be able to see the distance from the tip to the surface. And the second is through the same element, you can deliver ultrasound energy to actually ablate the tissue. So it has both capabilities. So this is a cartoon that shows what the idea is. The idea is you put this in the chamber, Then the system would, in a predefined fashion, rotate around and using M mode, try to define the anatomy. So red is far, blue is close, and so you can define a three-dimensional anatomy. Then the operator could define where the ablation should be done on the system, and the system would start ablating and isolating. So again, it's a very nice cartoon. We'll have to see how well it works in real life. We do have some data. We did some work with the early generation of this, and we were actually able to ablate. This is just a voltage map pre and post ablation. This is some preclinical data that Jacob Caruth in our animal lab did, just showing the lesions. And the other interesting aspect of this is that theoretically we could also see tissue thickness, because with M mode you could see tissue thickness. Now this supposes that you'll be able to differentiate the epicardial surface from whatever's on the other side. And that's not always so easy, but I think it definitely has possibilities. So this is, again, it's certainly not ready for prime time. It's in clinical testing, and we'll see how it goes. The second is this, the globe catheter. It's very different than any other technology that we've ever seen. Instead of trying to adapt to the atrial anatomy, this catheter tries to make the atrium adapt to it. So the idea is to put this globe catheter in the chamber and basically smash it up against the tissue. So the tissue is up against this. And if you do that, then you could, in theory, both map and ablate from each of these electrodes. Here's what it looks like. This is from Hans Kotkamp, who did this work. I haven't used this particular catheter. So it's a little horrible looking, but once you get it in position, then suddenly you have a situation where you're sitting at the console and clicking on points. And you could imagine also, for example, looking at atrial fibrillation maps and on this. Now, of course, there'll be questions of if you're pushing this, will you stretch it? Will that cause change in electrophysiology, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's a very interesting concept. The last is low energy electroporation. And there's two approaches that this is being used. One is an endocardial approach where a circular mapping catheter is being put in the veins and to ablate for PV isolation. And the second is an epicardial linear catheter for a box action, and I'll get to that. First question is why? Well, unlike everything else I've showed, electroporation is non-thermal ablation. And it takes about that long to do the ablation lesions. So speed is one of the most attractive aspects of it. But there are other potential advantages. There's been a lot of work by Fred Whitcamp's group. They published a number of papers. These are just 3 of them. And their data suggests that there's minimal, if any, effect in terms of the pulmonary vein fibrosis and proliferation causing PV stenosis. Minimal effect on the phrenic nerve, minimal effect on the esophagus, and minimal effect on the vasculature. I mean, it really does sound quite magical in terms of an energy source. And of course, we have to be careful of magical things. But having said that, I think it's a very interesting technology. This, by the way, is the approach for the epicardial ablation. The idea is to put a loop around the pulmonary veins and posterior wall. To do that, you have to deal. You have to deal with these reflections: the SVC to right superior pulmonary reflection, the IVC to right inferior pulmonary reflection. And the company has a very interesting way of dealing with this, taking 2 catheters with magnets on either side, so you connect on either side of the reflection and punch a hole through. But in any event, the idea is you put a wire around, you pass the catheter around, and then you basically ablate between these electrodes and deliver electroporation. The preclinical data looks pretty good with homogeneous lesions, and we'll just have to see. This has not been used in humans yet. This is still probably about a year away. I was going to talk about the esophagus. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this. I'm going to go forward. We can talk about that more. Okay. I've been talking about paroxysmal AFib. What about non-paroxysmal AFib? Persistent and long-standing persistent. Well, if I take you through my cartoon here, I think our understanding of the physiology is changing. In addition to the trigger, we believe that there are rotors or drivers, depending on what terminology you want to use, that cause fibrillary conduction and perpetuate this. All of you know about, of course, the ECG imaging, and you know that at least I would say that most people now agree that it's probably not a single stable rotor, but probably areas that support transient rotor-like activity. And so I think our understanding of the physiology is changing. It's also interesting, this is from work from Michelle's group, looking at patients at different stages. Persistent AFib will present in sinus, persistent for 1 to 6 months, persistent for 7 to 12 months, and long-standing persistent. And what they observe, I think some of the data that Phil has is that you see an increased number of regions that seem to support this rotor-like activity. And by the way, to me, this is one of the most exciting aspects of ECG imaging. It's not even the potential for directing where to ablate, but simply the possibility that we may be able to better characterize persistent AF patients beyond simply persistent and long-standing persistent. Definitions that we know are crude, but we don't have any choice. Instead, if we could use an approach like ECG imaging to be able to better characterize the substrate, I think that by itself would have an important impact in clinical practice. Anyway, we do know that as the disease state progresses, as there's more scar tissue that seems to develop in the heart, the success of ablation drops off. And this is the DCAF study showing that when there's very little scar tissue, the success is better than when there's a lot of scar tissue, which is stage 4. What was the old approach? The old approach was to isolate the veins, then which probably organized the atrium to some extent, perhaps make some linear lesions, which may organize the atrium further, and eventually ablate these sites that we call cafes, that nobody can ever decide what exactly is a cafe, but ablate these areas, and then ultimately, many of these patients we could get into sinus rhythm. And it is true, if you look at multi-center studies, ablation using the stepwise approach was better than antiarrhythmic drugs. But we still had a lot of problems with this approach. First, these were arduous procedures. A lot of ablation, took a lot of time, and had a big impact on the patients. And certainly there was technical failure because of a residual rotor/driver region. The other problem is, of course, we still had the problem of P reconnection, and we also had the problem of atypical flutters when you did this much ablation. And oftentimes these atypical flutter rhythms were even more symptomatic for the patients than the original atrial fibrillation. So I think a lot of us have moved away from this, and of course, I think the nail in the coffin was this study called STAR-AF2, which basically looked at 3 strategies: PVI isolation, PVI plus cafe, PVI plus lines, and basically what you see is no significant difference between these approaches. So on the one hand, you look at this and say, the PVI alone strategy is the best strategy that we have, because why do all the other ablation? On the other hand, the best strategy that we have, even at 1 year, only has a success rate of 50%, which is not good. So we clearly do need to do more. By the way, I should say that the idea of using balloons for persistent AFib, and this is a paper that was, I guess, is still in press, but there are definitely going to be studies looking at balloon ablation for persistent AFib. But none of these are going to be that good. If you have 50% success rates, that clearly is not where we want to be. Where do we want to be? Well, I hope it's going to be something like this, where in addition to PV isolation, we're able to identify these regions to support this activity and ablate them, and everything is good. These are 2 systems that you're well aware of that are being, this is in patients in the U.S., this hopefully will be in patients in the U.S. in the next couple of months. I also want to talk about this system. This is a system by a company called Acutus Medical, which is a very interesting technology, trying to also do far field mapping but from the inside. It's a very interesting catheter. I don't know how they can make this for any reasonable cost, but anyway, it's a basket catheter which has electrodes for measuring far field electrical activity, but also has ultrasound transducers at each of these electrodes. So it's able to use the ultrasound to basically create a surface. So the first step is you put the basket in the chamber, and you basically just rotate it, which anybody can do. And as you rotate, it's picking off the surface, and obviously it has some algorithm so that's to minimize the chance of picking out, the structures really far away when it jumps forward, because it's going to take too long for it to display. But the idea is ultimately, you create something that looks sort of like a left atrium, and then you smooth it so it looks even closer to left atrium. Next, the system is able to use both inverse and forward algorithms to basically calculate or to estimate the dipole density. This is all far field, of course. And then ultimately you get something like this. So this is a case that we did, an atypical flutter patient, somebody had previous ablation. And what you're going to look at here on the left is the dipole density map, and this is the far field voltage map. I don't have the, we did a contact map also, but I don't have that here, unfortunately. But what you see, at least, again, what appears to happen is that the dipole density seems to give you a little bit greater focus in terms of the activation. And so this is a case where you can see something sort of filtering through here between the left pulmonary veins and left atrial appendage. And indeed, entrainment here showed a good post-pacing interval, and ablation there terminated this flutter. In fact, all these dots actually represent areas where we had done entrainments all around this location. Go forward. And now here, this is a sort of interesting. This is not our case. This is from a different hospital. And here they put this in the chamber and just mapping atrial fibrillation. And I don't know what this means, but it looks like there's an area where there's activity that's being visited, or this area is being visited by electrograms by activity relatively frequently. So it's interesting. I don't think there's enough data. All this experience is very early. I have no idea how specific these locations are. There's still, I think, a lot of algorithmic work that they will have to do. Here's another map that shows a little bit more history during atrial fibrillation. If you squint your eyes and use your imagination, you get the impression that something is happening here somewhat repetitively. Maybe somewhat repetitively here, but you get the idea. I mean, it's the same general idea of what you guys have been doing here. Here, obviously, you have the advantage that you can see the whole chamber. You have the disadvantage you can only see one chamber. So you're not gonna, unless you have, I suppose, baskets in each chamber. So I think it's just another approach to try to help us do single beat mapping of the atrium. But clearly, whether you're talking about what Topera is doing, Cardiac Insight's doing, what these guys are doing, or whoever else that I don't know about, the idea of single chamber mapping is something that I think has become very important in electrophysiology. So I think this is my synopsis for persistent AFib. PV isolation, it clearly has been shown to improve outcome. We've got to get better at it. No additional ablation strategy has been shown to improve outcomes, and we need something else. Of course, durability is suboptimal. We have to improve that. The question is, what else do we do? And I think we're moving toward this, trying to find these AF sources or rotors. But clearly, we need a lot more data. Last 2 points. What's new in AF management? There's 2 things I just wanted to bring up. The first is AF and CHF, because I think this is such an important thing, and I think this is becoming increasingly important. We know that people who have heart failure, who develop atrial fibrillation, do quite poorly. They tend to spiral downhill at that point. And an important question has been, what if you stop the atrial fibrillation in these heart failure patients who develop AFib? Will they do better? Now, when I go to this, there was a study that was published about 8 years ago called AF-CHF. It was a very big study. It was a very important trial. They basically randomized heart failure patients who develop AFib to either rate control or rhythm control. And rhythm control was basically amiodarone. So it was amiodarone versus rate control. And what happened was, if you look at the primary endpoint, which is mortality, there was no difference in mortality. So this went against the concept that getting rid of atrial fibrillation in these patients would improve outcome. So that is one. So the question was, why was there's no difference? And one is this possibility: rhythm control confers no benefit over rate control in this population. But there's an alternate possibility, which is any benefit of rhythm control with amio may be balanced by the negative effects of amio, because we know that amiodarone is not a good drug for heart failure patients. So the question is, are we seeing here the balancing out? And then there were a couple of papers published recently, 2 single-center studies, which I'm not going to show you, but in a multi-center study, which just got published in Circulation, where these investigators took heart failure patients with reduced ejection fraction, class 2 or class 3 heart failure, persistent AFib, and randomized them to either ablation or amiodarone. And now the primary endpoint was a composite of AF recurrence, and not surprisingly, ablation did better than amio, and that's no big surprise. And honestly, that's not what's interesting. What's really interesting is this: if you look at the secondary endpoints of hospitalization there was an improvement of ablation over amio. And most importantly, if you look at mortality, mortality was actually less. So mortality in the ablation group was 8%. In the amio group, it's 18%. So there was a 10-point decrease in mortality over 24 months. This is a really big deal. Now again, this is a secondary endpoint. It's not a huge study, and it's a single study. But this is the first time that ablation has been shown to improve mortality in any disease state, any cardiac disease, any cardiac arrhythmia. So if this is true, and a 10-point difference in mortality, this rivals what we do with implantable defibrillators. It's really impressive. So this suggests that atrial fibrillation is a very bad actor in heart failure patients. So I think this is going to be an important clinical situation, and certainly it'd be very interesting to look at what the differences are in terms of how AF behaves in heart failure patients, whether it's looking at ECG or other approaches. The other thing, all of you know about this, I'm going to go through this quickly. In terms of affecting the underlying disease process, there's two things I want to talk about. Oh, actually, two things, yeah. Sympathetic modulation and obesity. And I'm going to bring up sympathetic modulation first, because this is a very interesting paper that was published a couple of years ago. These investigators, this is hard to read, but basically they took patients who were planned for an AF ablation procedure, and they randomized these patients to either AF ablation alone or AF ablation plus administration of moxonidine. Moxonidine is a centrally active antisympathetic agent. It's used for hypertension, but the reality is that the majority of these patients didn't even have hypertension. And what you see is a significant decrease in recurrence. It went recurrence from almost 40% of placebo group to 20%. And this was a blinded, placebo-controlled study. It's appeared to be a very well done study. So this suggests that after ablation, an anti-sympathetic intervention is actually quite favorable. And this, by the way, is completely consistent with other data that shows that patients with high sympathetic tone, whether you measure by MIBG or whatever, have a high incidence of recurrence after ablation. Now, the problem is moxonidine is not an easy drug to take. And one thing we're interested in, and this is some work from Evgeny Pokushlov in Siberia, where they took patients who had hypertension, but in refractory hypertension, so very severe hypertension, atrial fibrillation, and randomized these patients to AF ablation alone or AF ablation plus renal sympathetic denervation, another way to modulate the sympathetic nervous system. And you see a significant improvement in AF recurrence. They published another paper later, I think about 2 years ago, again showing similar outcomes of patients who, they just improved their numbers to about 80 patients. Based on this, we had the question, most patients, of course, don't have refractory hypertension. Could denervation be beneficial in the majority of our AF patients who have milder or controlled hypertension? So there's a study, it's an investigator-initiated study that we started, where we took patients who have AFib and some degree of hypertension, not refractory hypertension, but maybe on one drug or two drugs, who are planned for AF ablation, who after ablation we randomized in a placebo-controlled fashion, it was all in the same study, to either denervation or no denervation. We started this study, and after 50 patients at 10 sites, we actually stopped enrollment because we had safety issues regarding to denervation. I didn't get into that, but the fact is we were just using a regular EP ablation catheter and didn't go so well. But in terms of recurrences, there was actually, it appeared to be at least a signal in the right direction, that adding denervation seemed to decrease recurrence compared to AF ablation alone. So based on that, we recommenced the study, and we had like 10 patients enrolled, so we just started using a dedicated renal denervation catheter. And so I think, this is what we're doing, but the point is, I think that the future of AF management, at least from an interventional perspective, has to go beyond just ablation. I think we have to also try to address the trigger or the underlying physiology. I think this is one way, and I think the other way is clearly this. There's no doubt that obesity has a very important negative effect in terms of people with atrial fibrillation. It has really dramatic effects, and there's correlative data in the past that's shown that as atrial fibrillation progresses, there's more pericardial fat. And this was correlative, interesting. What was really interesting was this kind of work. This is work that from Prash Sanders' group in Adelaide in Australia. This is a non-randomized study where they took patients who were undergoing ablation. Some of them underwent an aggressive risk factor management protocol, including weight management, and others didn't. And what you see is after ablation, compared to the control group, who didn't fare very well after ablation, those that also started losing weight did better. And they went further. Legacy, again, this is non-randomized data, but again, it's very interesting. They took all their patients who were planned for an ablation procedure, or who were thinking about having ablation. They looked at that subset that had an elevated BMI, and then they offered weight management. And some of them did, and some of them didn't. And some they excluded because they were from different locations or whatever. But of the 355 that were included, some patients lost 10% of their body weight, which is pretty impressive. Others between 3 and 9%, others less than 3%. And when you look at the outcomes, it was interesting. Compared to baseline, over follow-up, those patients that lost weight had decreases in left atrial volume, which is incredible, as well as decreases in things like CRP. And I think what's most impressive about this is not so much that obesity is bad, I think we all knew that, but the fact that it's reversible in a time frame that's clinically relevant over the course of 6 to 12 months. So I think that's really extraordinary. I mean, the more we learn how bad obesity is. And then when you look at freedom from recurrence, those patients who underwent ablation or were treated with drugs and had at least a 10% loss in weight did much better than those that had less than 3% change in weight. It also, interestingly, I'm not going to go through all this, but it turns out that exercise is important both because of its weight loss as well as independent of its effect on weight. So those patients that did the best both lost at least 10% and exercised quite a bit, compared to those who neither had a significant weight loss or were able to exercise significantly. So exercise is important both because you're losing weight as well as it seems to have additional effects beyond the loss of weight. Okay, in my last 10 minutes, let me go through VT ablation. Technical issues, how to do it, and then clinical issues to whom to do it. I think when you think about scar VT ablation, one of the things we learned from all the mapping studies that were done is that it's not a simple circuit like this. That's not what typically happens. The best way to think about the substrate for VT is like this, where there are multiple potential pathways, any of which could be operative for any particular arrhythmia. So when you have a situation like this, and what you're looking at here is a patient with a large inferior wall infarct, this is the same voltage map, but pointing in the other direction. The first thing we do is we define the chamber. So the easiest way to define it is to simply look at each location. So if you move the catheter to these locations, you see a big electrogram. That's normal tissue. Versus here, it's a lower amplitude electrogram, fragmented, etc. That's abnormal tissue. So the first thing we do is define where is the scar. The second thing is then we target. And there's two general approaches that people have taken. One is to target the channels for ablation. So, for example, look at areas in the tissue that exhibit electrograms beyond the end of the QRS. That means even though most of the chamber is activated, as evidenced by the QRS, that after the end of the QRS, there's still electrograms here. That means at this location, there must have been some channel that it took time for the electrical activity to percolate to this location. So one approach that has gained favor is to basically map the scar, identify these late potentials, fragmented late potentials, and basically ablate all of them. So it's a way to sort of empirically homogenize these potential channels, and with the understanding that any one of these may not be operative for any particular tachycardia, but if you can safely ablate there and just ablate all of them, then hopefully you'll get rid of most or all tachycardias. Another approach is to target the VT exit sites, that is to pace along the border to identify where the VT is exiting, and then make targeted lesions, or ablate completely around the periphery. But probably the approach that's now sort of taking, I won't say taking favor, but people are certainly looking strongly at is, I'm going to skip this lava business, but basically an approach to target all of these different areas where you have late potentials, even some of these areas being in otherwise what we call normal tissue. And the final is the scar homogenization approach, which is basically paint the scar red. So the approach, I mean, on the one hand, this just sounds a little bit brain dead and crazy. On the other hand, what this strategy is saying is that our ability to identify these small electrograms is not very good with our current technology. So it's better to just deliver energy there and move on than to struggle about whether or not that's an important location. And Andre Natalia's group did a study where they compared an isthmus ablation approach versus what they called substrate ablation approach, and they showed improved success. The problem, of course, is we don't know what this means exactly. Right? It's hard to, the VT ablation strategy, these studies are very difficult because the definitions of isthmus ablation is so variable between different centers. But I still think it's an important study, basically suggesting that ablating more is better. And I think that's what we took away from this. Beyond post-MI VT, dilated cardiomyopathy VT is a very important issue. The problem in dilated cardiomyopathy is that number one, the incidence of this dilated cardiomyopathy is increasing. In our center, we don't see post-MI VT very often. We see mostly dilated cardiomyopathy VT. The scars are smaller, the channels are fewer, and the impact of substrate modification is less. So these are much more difficult patients to deal with. And the success rate reflects that compared to ischemic cardiomyopathy, non-ischemic cardiomyopathy. Look at the success rate, 40%. I mean, even here, the ischemic didn't do so well, 60%. But this is really not very good. How could we improve our outcomes? Well, one of the problems is, especially in dilated cardiomyopathies, we have these deep septal circuits, where the circuits are deep inside of the tissue, and they're difficult to actually reach. So one approach that sometimes is helpful is to put a catheter to support the blood pressure, so you keep the patient in VT so you can do careful mapping. I think it does help. Of course, you still have to decide what do you do when you have an intramural scar. So this is an example of a patient who has an intramural scar. You can't even see it. These blue dots and red dots represent the best locations on either side of the septum. So in this kind of a situation, the approach we sometimes use is bipolar ablation. So we'll put one catheter, like you see here, that's transseptal in the left ventricle, one catheter in the right ventricle, and we ablate in between these two. The other approach is alcohol ablation. So, this tissue is sometimes supplied by a coronary artery. So we can take a catheter, inject alcohol into the coronary artery to basically create a homogeneous infarct. And this sometimes is possible. And this is an example of one of the patients where we injected alcohol and the VT terminated, was eliminated. I think the future may also be neuraxial modulation, whether it's renal denervation or something like stellate gangliolectomy. Both of these are being studied in different centers. So again, the idea is substrate ablation and modulation of whatever trigger is initiating or perpetuating this. One area that I think we've had real success is RV dysplasia or ARVC-related VT. I think what we've learned is that if we do epicardial mapping, so go to the pericardial space with subxiphoid puncture and map and ablate the pericardial space, our success rates are quite good. This is some of the earlier data, almost a decade ago, with using endocardial-only ablation with RV dysplasia, and you see the success rates were dismal. But when you combine the epi and endo, the success rate is much, much better. Now again, you can't read this very well, there's only 17 patients. So we don't have huge studies with RV dysplasia. But the point is that when you use a combined approach, you can have very, very high success rates in terms of eliminating VT. When do you do VT ablation? Well, certainly as adjunctive therapy to ICD implantation, that's where it's typically done. So when patients have either slow VT or they have ICD shocks or stable or unstable VT, we do VT ablation. This is the first study that looked at this, called the Thermocool study. And on the left are the number of episodes pre-ablation. On the right, the number of episodes post-ablation. You can see they went from a median of 11.5 to 0. But you also see there's a significant percent of patients that had a significant number of events even after the ablation. So it's not perfect, but it's better than this. There is an important trial called VANISH, which is going to be presented at the late breaking at the HRS. So I'm very interested in seeing this. This is one of the few randomized trials in the VT ablation space. John Sapp did this study where he randomized patients to either ablation or drug therapy. And drug therapy was either starting amnio, increasing amnio if the patient was already on amnio, or adding mexilatine. And it took a long time. He started this study and what is it, 2009. But he finished the study, and we're going to see what the follow-up looks like. So I think that'll be very interesting. There is non-randomized data that's interesting. This is Paolo Delabella's work, and what he's showing here, in a very large series of patients, over 500 SCAR VT patients who underwent ablation. If you look on the left, this is freedom from VT recurrence as a function of whether or not the VT was rendered non-inducible completely, meaning no VT was inducible at the end of the procedure, if only non-clinical VTs were inducible at the end of the procedure, or even the clinical VT was inducible at the end. And what you see is, if you don't induce any VT or only induce non-clinical VT, the success in terms of VT recurrence is quite good compared to if you fail during the initial procedure. But what's also really interesting is if you look at cardiac mortality, mortality is better, that is less mortality, if you get rid of the VT. This is another study. This is a multi-center study including over 2,000 patients looking at transplant-free survival if you had no VT recurrence or if you have VT recurrence. And you see a significant improvement in survival. Again, suggesting that if you can get rid of the VT, then patients do better. Of course, the other option is that no, it's simply that sick patients who are about to get transplant have VT recurrence. So we don't, that issue is still there. This is an interesting paper that Jared Bunch did this. So I understand your point, but and the answer is not that we need something that necessarily makes us better if we're already good at it. I think the issue is to come up with tools that anybody can use that sort of levels the playing field in terms of technical expertise. I mean, look, you go to any hospital in the country, you'll get the same appendectomy, right? And you'll pretty much get the same procedure for AV and RT ablation. But you're not going to get the same procedure for AF ablation, and that's a problem. So I think I would argue that until it's pretty much the same procedure in 90% of the centers, there is still a role for technology improvement. I agree with you in terms of cost, but the companies do a pretty good job of, I mean, they're thinking about that all the time, right? Because they know that the strategics who are going to buy them, if they buy them, are always going to be looking at how much is it going to cost, how much can they sell this for, and how much money they're going to make. So I understand your point. I think it's an important point, but I think that they still have hope.
Two questions related to atrial fibrillation. In your guideline, you mentioned that does the guideline recommend energy resources? For example, specify is a radio frequency ablation or cryo balloon? As you know, the mentioned fire and ice results confirmed very good results by Cook.
Yeah. So I think that right now there's radio frequency, there's cryo, and as I said just a week ago there was laser. So yeah, now you have 2 balloon catheters and 1 RF. Well, you have a whole bunch of RF catheters. If you look at the clinical trials, the FDA clinical trials, it's striking. The success rate is pretty much the same across the board. You look at the 1-year outcomes, it's extraordinary to me. They're all between 60 and 70%. Okay, no matter which technology you use. Now, of course, then you start looking at single centers, and then with experience they get better and whatever. But I think my guess is the guidelines are going to be relatively silent on this. There's no reason at this point to recommend one catheter over the other. That's from an evidence-based approach. Now, we all have our own personal biases on what we use. I tend to like radiofrequency ablation because of flexibility, and I feel like it's better, even though I don't have proof of it. But I think that the guidelines will pretty much stay as they are and talk more about the strategy and not about the technology. And I think that's appropriate at this point.
The second question is sort of linked to that is, do you think it's feasible that some of the atrial fibrillations or long PV or triggers or substrate are not ablatable by catheter ablation, if you will, and maybe other things, to deal with that? For rotors.
Yeah, I think. Well, I think the most important other thing are risk factor modification, like like dealing with obesity. As you saw, I'm pretty optimistic in terms of doing upstream therapy, like looking at sympathetic modulation. I hope that will be helpful. But ultimately, I think the majority of our work is still going to be catheter ablation. I think if we can't do it because they're long-standing persistent, then we're going to give up. I don't see too many other options. I mean, maybe we will do extensive ablation and keep our fingers crossed. But I don't. The one other area, by the way, that I didn't talk about, which I think is very interesting, is some of the work that Evgeny Pokuslev has done in terms of injecting botulinum toxin into the epicardial fat pads. That some of the data that they presented has been very interesting, and one wonders whether there'll be a rejuvenation of interest in looking at that. But I still think that the majority of our work is going to be isolating veins, trying to find these sources that perpetuate AF in the atrium, and also identifying non-PV triggers.
Any other questions? Thank you again.